this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
The Renault FT is often described as the world's first modern tank, and with good reason. Developed by the French during the First World War, it introduced a revolutionary design, a fully rotating turret mounted on a tracked chassis. With a crew of just 2, it was light, agile and simple. By the end of the war, more than 3,000 Renault FTs had been built, and its influence spread far beyond France. Nearly every tank that followed borrowed something from its layout. It served in dozens of armies around the world, fought on into the Second World War, and even saw its use in conflicts as far afield as China and South America. To explore the story of this remarkable little machine, its design, its service, and its legacy, I'm joined once more by Robby Houben from the Belgian Royal Military Museum. Robby, thanks for joining me again. So let's start with this description of the FT being the first modern tank. It seems like a big claim.
I think it's mostly due because the tank features a few elements which are now characteristic of how we view a tank. As a first rotating turret on top of the vehicle. You already had turrets on armored cars or battleships, for example, but this is the first mass-produced vehicle which also features a fully 360-degree rotating turret. And next to that, you also have 2 tracks flanking the hull in which a crew resides, and also an engine in a separate compartment at the back. At the larger British tanks, which were developed a bit earlier, the crew was together with the engine inside the main hull, which is very inconvenient. But on this vehicle, the engine was in a separate compartment at the back of the vehicle, which greatly improves its functionality, and it's much nicer for the crew, of course.
It looks more like what we would call a tank than those big British tanks for the First World War, where I guess the design fell out of fashion in the 20s, and that this Renault design with the turret sort of goes on. So when was a tank designed and when does it enter service? Is it all happening at around the same time as that British tank? Where does it fit in the timeline?
So the Renault FT specific was designed in 1916, and this was at the moment already the second year of the war, in which the French economy was in a very bad state. There was a lot of manpower shortage, resources shortage in the factories as well. And the story actually starts with this French general, Estienne, who is often described as the father of the tank. He was an artillery officer, and he has always been a very large advocate of finding new ways of artillery to help the soldiers overcome this trench problem that they had at the moment. And already in 1914, there is this famous quote of him in which he said, "Gentlemen, the victory of this war will belong to which of the 2 belligerents, which will be the first to place a 75mm gun on a vehicle able to be driven on all terrain." So he already had this idea of, we will need this to overcome this new kind of warfare, but idea itself only was developed a little bit later. He was also one of the key figures behind the actual first French tank, which was the Schneider, which was developed earlier. And that is also still very much a land ship like the first British tanks, very large vehicle, 1 cannon in front, a few machine guns as well. So more as a breakthrough vehicle. Estienne, he also was already in contact with Renault itself to see if he was also interested or not, but Renault wasn't really interested in the idea of this heavy vehicle. They didn't want to get involved. But a little bit later, Estienne also developed this idea of developing a light tank, an actual infantry tank to accompany the infantry, to go alongside them and to help them in the field with additional firepower. And this was an idea which also appealed to Renault, actually. Heavy tanks didn't interest him, but for this, he also became intrigued and he started developing a prototype for this idea. This would become the char mitrailleuse, so the machine gun tank, which he developed, a very tiny vehicle, only 2 crew members, and actually developed to accompany the infantry and to help them along the way on the battlefield. This prototype was developed. Estienne was very happy with it. However, this was not the case for the other members of the military staff. There were a lot of bureaucratic delays. He had a lot of opposition. Some people wanted to prioritize the heavy tank program, Others liked it. Some compared it, the new Renault FT vehicle, to a charmant jouet, a small little toy, very fun to look at, but not really useful on the battlefield itself. And others wanted to use the money for artillery tractors. So also industry was in a bad state. There was not a lot of money, and you really had to prioritize on what to use it. However, when comparing this new prototype tank to the other heavy tanks, it was very clear to see that the mobility was a lot better. It was much easier to use. It had a lot of advantages as well. Also, Estienne, he organized additional test shows to the military staff when some of his opponents were out of the country. So really tried to play it well and to see that his idea would come up front with the military staff. Then in 1917, in the summer, you have the battle at Chemay-les-Dames, a failed French offensive, which really puts the army in a very bad state. There was a mutiny. The soldiers were not happy with the circumstances. And in general, the army was in a very bad state. Then you had some military reforms, and Pétain becomes the new commander-in-chief. And he makes a promise to the French army that he would try to prevent new large offensive until new tanks would be developed and would be available in force, and until the Americans would also be able to help them. He makes a kind of promise to hold off the large offensive, the needless massacres until that moment. He also likes a new idea, the new FT tanks, and he tries to help Estienne, and he also prioritizes this new vehicle instead of the heavier tanks because he also sees potential in it. Then that's the summer of 1917. However, production was started, but there were a lot of delays because there were steel shortage, they had difficulties obtaining the guns, a lot of problems. And in 1917 itself, only 84 Renault FT tanks were produced, so not really a lot. And it's only until in the beginning of 1918, the spring of 19, that they actually get delivered to the front and that their training started. However, in February of 1918, there were only 108 delivered, and all of these had no armament installed. So only the vehicles themselves. So they could start training, but yeah, not proper training, of course. And it was only until April of 1918 that around 450 were delivered, and actual training could commence and it could be divided in the organization. So around the spring of 1918, that's when the tank enters the French army and is used.
They've got 400 of them. How are they planning on using them? Are they using them in units of 3 or 4? Are they, when it comes to the attack, are they thinking that they're going to be swarming the enemy? Because it's a lighter tank as well, isn't it, than certainly that British?
Indeed.
Is it limited to, have I got it right? It's limited to 7 tons.
Exactly. The idea behind the tank was a light tank to accompany infantry, a char mitrailleuse, a machine gun tank. Where this idea comes from, the first British heavy tank attack was at the Somme in September of 1916. However, the French at that moment were already also working on their own tank program, and that actually demanded the British to wait until they could join them and have a larger surprise effect with more additional tanks. But the British, there was no formal agreement made. So the British, they kept them informed of their technical progress with the vehicles, but not of their planning. So the British used the tanks at the Somme. The French were not so happy about it because there were a lot of discussions if it was a bit of a spoiled surprise or maybe a necessary experiment. And even the British Prime Minister at the time also said about it that the great secret was sold for a battered ruin of a little hamlet on the Somme, not worth capturing. After this event, the Battle of the Somme, the tanks were used. They had a large moral effect on the Germans, but maybe not the biggest strategic effect at that moment. But the French, they studied the battle and they expected after this that the Germans would be responding more with artillery when this new weapon would be used. And that's why Estienne, he developed this idea of the B theory. And that is many small little vehicles to swarm the enemy positions instead of a few large, slow-moving tanks. And also what we have to keep in mind is that for every large heavy tank, such as a Saint-Chamond or a Schneider tank, 5 FTs could be built. So it was a lot easier to produce, a lot faster to produce, and many more could be made. And also that's 5 cannon instead of 1 cannon, a smaller target as well, shooting from different directions. So there's a lot of advantages to be seen as well. And also what we have to remember is that if you're in a Renault FT or in a larger, heavier tank, if artillery is shooting at you, your armor is not going to protect you in either of those 2 vehicles. So it's too strong to resist anyways. So that's why he developed this idea of the light tank to accompany infantry. And as you said, it was limited to 7 tons. And that's because it was developed as a light vehicle. It was only a 4-cylinder gasoline engine, which delivered 39 horsepower. The problem is, with a higher rate, that would mess up the power-to-weight ratio, actually. And also, it was not possible for Renault to acquire higher performance engines because they were also prioritized for the aircraft industry to other industries. So he was limited in the tools that he could use, actually. Just to compare, this Renault FT has a 39 horsepower engine with which he could go about 8 kilometers an hour. For example, the Mark IV. It has a 105 horsepower engine. The tank weighs 28 tons and goes 6 kilometers an hour, 7, also very slow. But the Whippet, which was developed as a faster cavalry tank to exploit any breakthroughs, it has 2 45 horsepower bus engines. It weighs 14 tons and it goes 13 kilometers an hour, so a lot faster. But for this one, it was really limited in the tools that it could use, and also a limited weight, and really to accompany infantry, not to perform any cavalry charge or anything, but just to keep up with the infantry and provide support for them.
I never thought of that the industry is a bit of a compromise when it comes to these tanks, because you can only put in the engines what you can get. And presumably, when you're building more tanks than you've got guns for, it's because those guns are being built, but they're going to be issued as field guns because they're the immediate need rather than guns for this newfangled tank that no one's quite sure how well it's going to work. So the tank's always sort of a strange compromise of industrial production and what they can get to bring the whole thing together.
37mm gun that this tank uses, it also derived from the 37mm Tigre Rapide fast shooting infantry gun. Yeah, they all have to keep in mind that that both of the weapons as also the engines are also needed in other branches of the army. So it's also always a compromise to see what gets the priority.
What we didn't tackle was the designation of FT. Where does that name come from? Is it actually is it really called FT, or is that something that's later been added?
The official name was the Char Légère light tank Renault FT. And this FT, it has given a lot of problems during the last age in how the tank was described, because it's the Renault FT, the FT-17, there are a lot of names for it. And often people think that the FT is an abbreviation of something. It has been said that it's Force Terrestre, Land Army, Franchisseur de Tranchées, Crosser of Trenches. But actually this FT is just a factory designation of Renault for this specific design of theirs. Each of their designs, they were giving a 2-letter code. And you also had, for example, the Renault AG, which is a kind of a small truck called the Taxi de la Marne, the Marne taxi. You also had the EG, which is an artillery tractor for pulling artillery pieces. Later in World War II, you had the Renault UE, which is a kind of a small carrier vehicle. So they just have this means of calling their designs like that. And the FT-17, the Renault, it was also called the Char Légère Model 1917. And later in books about the war, it has been described as the FT-17 because of that Model 1917 at the end. And I believe that also the Germans perhaps had a hand inside this, because when they captured a lot of the Renault FTs, they also gave their own designation to the vehicles. And I believe even that they called the FT-17 for the machine gun tanks and FT-18 for the cannon tanks. Not really sure of that, but there are a lot of reasons which caused the confusion.
I wonder if that's to do with the years that the Germans saw them, and they maybe saw more of the cannons in 1918.
Yeah, and also the cannon tank was just developed a little bit later than the machine gun variant. The tank was originally developed as a machine gun tank, but the cannon came slightly afterwards.
So how did it perform on the Western Front?
Its performance, in general, I would say that for the tank, the main advantage was that it was able to keep up with the infantry. And it could also go places where larger vehicles, such as a Mark IV tank, could not go. For example, it could follow the infantry in forests, up steeper slopes. It was able to really accompany them and to give fire support, which is a large advantage. Also in open terrain, they were very capable to charge enemy fortifications, disable machine gun nests, and that function they performed quite well. But also another large advantage was the big morale boost that they gave to the infantry. The French army was, as I said, in a very bad state after those failed offensives of 1917, and they really needed a kind of a morale boost, something to rejuvenate their fighting spirit. And this Renault FT tank actually was very good for that reason. They didn't face the fortifications and the machine gun nests alone. They were able to go alongside these tanks, to hide behind them. So it was really nice that they actually had some help with that. However, there were not grand offensives, grand drives in 1918 for the Renaults, such as the Battle of Cambrai, which had been for the British tanks. Only like a continuous string of small, brutal assaults in which they helped the infantry tackle the enemy fortifications and defensive positions. These skirmishes, they are not really like the birth of the Blitzkrieg, because they were not fast at all, but they certainly helped end the area of the trench warfare, as they say. Maybe also word about the German response. They were mostly used to attack the German defensive positions, and the Germans actually responded by improving their defenses, by making more concrete bunkers to hide their machine gun nests. Those gave a lot more problems for the small Renault FTs. They really had to drive up close to those bunkers to really aim their gun and fire on the small slit to reach the inside. And the Germans, they also they learned to aim their machine guns at the small visors and openings of the tank. So there was also the danger of machine gun spall getting inside the tank. And that's why they also were, just as their British counterparts, like chainmail masks, additional protection on the inside, very uncomfortable. But that was also an effect later.
Did they have enough of them to use them en masse in that swarm? Did the swarm, the idea of a swarm actually work in reality?
I'd say no, because there were never enough FTs actually. Another problem was around April of 1918, there were maybe 450 around that number delivered. But the problem was that a month earlier, the German spring offensive had started, and quite quickly, that offensive also threatened the training grounds where they were training with their vehicles at Champlieu. So the problem was they got some vehicles delivered, but they were just starting their training and they had to be moved, reorganized, find new locations. So the training was really disrupted and they didn't get a lot of chances to really get to know their vehicles. And especially with the guns, which were delivered in delays, there were a lot of problems with the training as well. And also, one of the biggest problems with the training of the Renault FT was that they barely had any training with the infantry as well. This weapon was developed to accompany infantry and to work alongside them, but it hadn't really been trained to use like that. Also, the tanks had been hoarded for combat use because they were very easily mechanically exhausted. So they were really training was limited and they were really hoarded to be used in those encountering that German offensive as well.
I was going to ask about that mechanically, because if you are operating in a swarm, you don't want to get to the engagement with the enemy and find out everybody in your swarm has broken down. So were they mechanically reliable? I mean, do they have common faults that kept coming up? We
also have to keep in mind that the whole industry, the automotive industry, was really still in a very maybe not primitive state, but not in a modern state.
Yeah, it's cutting edge at the time.
Even like the main idler reel of the Renault FT, it's still made of wood, coming directly from like a chariot. So there's things that you have to keep in mind. But the tank itself, it was only good for a few dozens hours of operation before the engine needed an overhaul. And there were also a lot of mechanical problems as well. One of the biggest ones was the fan belt of the vehicle. It was a major issue. And there were even accounts that one American company used one new fan belt per tank per day. So that's a lot of stress for the supply chain as well. And the problem with this was that these were first of poor quality and secondly also used by inexperienced drivers, which didn't have a lot of training as well. If the driver would be pushing the vehicle to its limits, the fan belt could snap, or if after prolonged use, the fan belt could start swelling and slipping. And if the driver didn't notice it, the engine could overheat, cylinders could jam, and eventually the crankcase could be split of the tank. And there wasn't a solution found during the war for that problem as well. The only thing that they had to keep in mind was to be cautious, to check it appropriately if it needed replacement or not. And also, of course, experience for the driver, which would help eventually prevent this problem. And also because of all the production delays in the tank and the parts of the tank as well, there was always this low availability of spare parts. The tank itself, the crew could work on it quite easily, but there were just not enough tanks, not enough parts to go around to actually keep this fleet running.
Does Renault build all of them? Is there a different manufacturer? I wonder if different manufacturers suffered this, if different manufacturers did different things and had different faults.
So Renault, of course, had made the design, At first, they were the sole producer of the vehicle, but after Pétain becomes a new commander-in-chief, the order gets enlarged from about, I think, initially less than 1,000, but eventually the order is very large, almost 10,000, but this gets decreased again at the end of the war. But at first only built by Renault, but he eventually, when the order increases, has to waive their patent also to other manufacturers. Renault itself, it stays the largest producer of the vehicle, and they ultimately built 1,950 of the a bit more than 3,000 tanks produced, and that comes up to 52% of the total production during the war. Then you also have Berliet, which is another French firm. They produce 100 tanks, and that's 22% of the production. Saumur, Société d'Outillage Mécanique et d'Usinage Artillerie, they're mostly known for the tanks that they produced later in World War II. They were a production firm of Schneider, and they produced 600 tanks. That's 17%. And then you have a fourth, Delaunay Belleville, and they produce 8% of the tanks, which are 280 tanks in total. But then you also have some subcontractors, for example, Boulogne-Billancourt, which are producing tracks for the vehicle. It's a bit like with the large British tanks, which have different manufacturers, and then they come together at an assembly shop, and a tank gets completed. Another thing, at first, the tank was developed as a machine gun tank, and it had a machine gun turret. But after the first testing, it was considered that this machine gun turret was too small. It was very cramped inside, not large enough. And then they were looking for a solution to improve the turret. And the design came from Berliet, which also produced the tank itself, but they also developed a new turret. That's what they call the Berliet polygonal turret. It has straight edges. It's made of welded plates, so a geometric shape. And this was also called the omnibus turret, because this could not only house the machine gun, but also the new Caron variant, which was also developed. So it could be used for the two of them. And then a little bit later, you also had the firm Acier Paul Giraud, so the steel foundry of Paul Giraud, which developed the round turret for the Renault FT. And this is a turret that is more dominant in the last year of the war and in later production vehicles. And it's a fully round cast turret. So not a welded one like the Berliet turret, but a cast round turret. And this is also an omnibus turret, which can be used for both the machine gun and the gun variant. Then for production-wise, those are the French firms producing the tank. When America enters the theater of war, they also have plans to start using the Renault FT. At first, they wanted to make their own license copy of the tank and only use that one. But eventually they're not ready in time, and they also use French FTs. But they also plan to have a license production in the States of a similar vehicle as well. And that's what is going to be called the 6-ton special tractor, or the 6-ton Model 1917 tank, abbreviated as the M1917 vehicle. It's very similar to the Renault FT, only the engine is different. Also, you can see the change, the gun, the turret itself. You can also see the difference in there, but the general shape of the tank is very similar. And of those, only 64 were made before the end of the war. So the Americans used the French FTs in combat. But when the production was finally finished in the years later, 950 were built in total. And those were really key to the American tank training after the war. Then Italy, they also received a few Renault FTs for testing in June 1918, but they also had plans to start a license production, and this will become the Fiat 3000, and 152 were built of that type as well. And then the Soviets, they also liked the design, and they produced a similar vehicle as the T-18 or MS-1, 960 built. So quite large numbers for a small little tank like that.
It is, and it's widely adopted internationally, which is, for an ultra-modern piece of kit, must say something about what people thought of it. How are the units organised within the French army? Because obviously there's a new arm of the army. How did they see them as being organised into units?
So they were initially organised into light tank battalions, BCL, Bataillon de Chars Légers, it was called. And each of these battalions had a full strength of 75 tanks. Each of these battalions had 3 companies, and each company was devised in a certain way. They had a company headquarters, which was normally equipped with a radio tank. The normal tanks didn't have a radio, but a variant was developed as well. It was the Renault TSF, Télégraphie sans fil, and it kept the hull of the tank, but essentially a large box was replacing the turret in which the crew could use a radio. For the rest, it's a very similar vehicle, but it didn't have any ornament, just this radio box. So that would be the company headquarters. Then you have 3 fighting sections, each of them containing 5 tanks. You also had a support element with a reserve echelon with 5 replacement tanks, a supply and recovery section, and the company workshops with a transport attachment. And that's how these small battalions were organized, and you had 3 of them. So 3 times 75 tanks, and they were each instructed to accompany infantry units to go into battle. These different companies also had a very distinctive marking, which helped them to identify the vehicle and the section, etc. And those are the famous playing card symbols that you find on the vehicles. So at first, you have a geometric shape, which is in white on the back of the vehicle. And this shape is in a circle, a square, or a triangle. Circle means first company, square means second company, triangle, third company. Then you also have a section indication, and that is a playing card. And the spade means the first section of that company. Heart is second section, diamond for third section, and a club for the reserve section. Then you also have the indication of the company as well. The battalion. And the battalion is determined by the color of the playing card symbol, which could be blue for the first light tank company, red for the second, and yellow for the third. Later, this whole division is also kept inside more larger units, the Régiment d'Artillerie Spéciale, not the light tank companies, but the special artillery companies. But also these 3 large companies are kept, and they are used to accompany the infantry. Now, this is theoretically this number that I said, 75 per tank company, but due to the delivery delays, due to the high rate of attrition, these companies only very rarely had their full strength in numbers, actually, because they were always in action. Many of them were they could lose half of their strength in a single day of fighting. So there was always the need for more tanks and more mechanical overall.
At 7 tons, they're relatively small, especially compared to the British tanks. I wondered if these tank battalions had their own embedded transportation units. Is it possible to get these on the back of trucks, so you have the first tank transporters, as opposed to just relying on rail travel? Have they invented another new arm of the military, the tank transporter?
Indeed, because tanks were so mechanically sensitive, they always try to find ways to spare them of driving too much before they would enter the battlefield, and they would also be transported on the back of trucks. That looked quite silly because the trucks as well were also not that big at the time, but they fitted and they were driven to the field of operations before they would be unloaded for action. And for more rear echelon actions, they would also try to use the rail network as much as possible because it's, of course, much easier. But indeed, transport by trucks was also new, developed for this vehicle. And also had to be said that the tank itself, it only has a limited combat range of 35 kilometers. So that's really not a lot when the tank still has to go in action as well. And also refueling the tank in action would be very cumbersome because, of course, it is driven in no man's land or in a field of action. And the lorries with the fuel could not easily, could not reach the tanks when they were in operation. And that's also, another new thing was developed, and that was that some of the echelon tanks, which would follow the advance, they would be carrying sleds on which additional supplies and additional fuel would be carried. So they would just be carried with the tanks itself on these sled type devices to do refueling close to the action.
Almost like supply tanks. So at the end of the First World War, a lot of countries are getting rid of armoured vehicles because they're expensive. Do they remain in service within the French army?
Indeed, they are kept in service for quite long and well into the 1930s, and even so sporadic combat in the 1940s and later. And also after World War I, it was actually the most widely used tank type, and it really formed the seed of which most of the world's largest tank forces, the US, the Soviet Union, would develop their new tank units. For example, the American M1917, it stayed well into the 1930s with the American forces. And they even delivered more than 200 to Canada in 1940 to also train with vehicles as well before they would go to the European theater of war. So it really yeah, it was really used for a long time. And also these FTs, they saw more action than any kind of other type of tank in the interbellum years. So they're used already in the Russian Civil War in 1918, the Russo-Polish War in 1920, Spain's Rif War in Morocco as well in the 1920s, and the Spanish Civil War, of course, also. So really a lot of these combats, they were present. And in France itself, it remained also in service, but in dwindling numbers, of course, because of mechanical reasons. And it even still saw combat in the 1930s. Well, in 1932, it was clear that the tank was getting old and obsolete. So France decided to replace the FTs as infantry tanks. And it was hoped that by 1938, they would be able to replace 16 battalions or 800 tanks. And by 1940, they would be able to replace 46 battalions or 2,500 tanks. But eventually this was not achieved because that's quite a high number. And also many of these units, they began converting to the Renault R35 or the Hotchkiss, the light tanks, also in the middle of the 1930s. But eventually at the end of the 1930s, you still have 500 tanks left in active service, not like in the front crack units, but more in rear echelon or training units. And even there are some FTs left for airfield security with the Air Force or in the French dominions like Syria, North Africa, Morocco, and also 1,000 more in depot, not being used, but after a small overhaul, again, ready for action. However, of most of the tanks in depots, they were a bit stripped of some of their equipment. For example, the guns, the 37mm guns, they're also used on the Renault R35 tanks, so they were stripped of that to be used. But next to that, they were still kept in decent condition. Also, France, there were plans to improve the Renault during the 1920s. They just had so many of them, so they didn't really see the need to start converting them anyways, because they had this large fleet still coming from World War I. And a few improvement programs. At first, you had a new Kigress type suspension that was added to the tanks with a rubber band track. So improved suspension, and that would lead to the Renault NC1. It had better cross-country performance, better armor as well. So an improved version. You also had a second line of development with also a new metal track, also a Kigress leaf suspension that would lead to the NC2, but that was continued. But the French military staff was not convinced of the design because it was just a small improvement of an old design, but they really wanted something new, something better. And so this new NC1 tank, it was only earmarked for export as the NC27 because the design was from 1927. So it was only exported and not used by the French themselves. And they exported a few examples to Yugoslavia, one for Poland, one for Sweden for testing, a few to Japan as well to complement their older FT tanks. And yeah, Yugoslavia, as I said. So not to be used by France itself. France itself did try out some other means of modernizing the tank. And for the machine gun vehicles, they modernized the weapon. It previously was a Hotchkiss 8mm gun, but they replaced it to a Rebelle 7.5mm MAC gun. So the Hotchkiss had a very limited small strip of ammunition that could be inserted in the gun. But this new Rebelle machine gun, it had a drum magazine, much more bullets, so it was much more handy. It also received a new mantlet, a bit of better protection, and a new ammunition storage system for this Rebelle gun. So the machine gun was replaced. And eventually there was also a development tank planned. This was the Renault D1. It has a 47mm gun, better armor, a better engine. But when these were developed, they also had a lot of production delays, and they were initially armed with the old FT turrets as well. And then later, after the 1932 program of France, where they wanted to have new kinds of tank types, they also started making the Hotchkiss and Renault R35 tanks as well, which are very similar, also small light tanks to accompany the infantry and have the same purpose as this old FT tank as well, but have much more mobility, better armor, and much more easier to use.
Right, let's pause there. Folks, we'll be back in a moment. So in Battle of France 1940, as all the French divisions moved into Belgium, did that mean the FT in those not first-rate necessarily units see action as the Germans swept round through the Ardennes?
So the French military staff was very very conscious about the state of this old Renault FT tanks, and they were not given to the troops actually protecting the borders, the important troops, but only remaining in training units in smaller detachments or in the French dominions as well. But actually, they still saw combat. A few examples for the French: they still had around 500 Renault FT tanks actually in active service in these different training units and everywhere. And these battalions, they were mostly kept in reserve. But one of these famous examples was at Château Thierry. It's a small French village next to the Marne River. And there you had a bridge over the Marne River, which was being protected by Officer Cadet de Rouge. He was an officer in training, so one of these tank training units. And he was tasked to guard this passing of the Marne River with this single FT tank over there. So he's guarding the bridge and he sees a German column approaching on the other side of the river. The column has French uniforms, French markings, but he suspects something is not right. And eventually the column on the other side, it opens fire and he realizes it's a trap. Those are Germans in disguise. So with a small FT tank, he manages to protect the bridge, not letting anyone cross it, and if really a large battle occurs, the Germans, they use anti-tank guns, armored cars, trucks, infantry. But he manages to keep them off bay, and eventually even the house beside it even crashes upon the tank, but still they manage to hold their position. And this really proves that even though it's an old tank, in many cases a tank is better than no tank, and he really manages to perform well in capable hands. It's really an emotional story. When having climbed outside of his tanks, he's in a really bad state. And the commander, Cadet de Rouge, he tells to his driver, "I'm leaving, but you'll fight well, won't you? Nothing is lost, you understand? Did you see earlier? There are lots of us who can do this." So really, he's emotional, but he's really glad that he was able to perform well. And later he dies the same day in a field hospital. But this really proves that although it's a very old vehicle, it still manages to in the capable hands to really stand its own. And this is now an example of France, but there are of course many other nations across the world, also in Europe, which are still using the Renault FT at the beginning of World War I. Also in Poland. Poland has actually been the fourth largest armored force in 1918, just after the war, because they then received 120 Renault FT tanks. So they were at that moment the fourth largest armored force after France, Great Britain, and the US. And in 1940, they still had around 70 operational Renault FT tanks, with their 111th, 112th, and 113th independent tank companies at the outbreak of the war. And they also had a few successful engagements. And the most famous one was the defense of the Brest Fortress against the German 10th Panzer Division in September of 1939. At first, one of these companies used 12 of their Renault FT tanks to repel an initial German assault, but they were eventually all destroyed or captured. And then some of the remaining Renault FT tanks, they were also used to actually guard the Brest Fortress to this German attack. And eventually a few of them were used to block one of the entrances of the fortress, just as a physical barricade. And a lot of pictures of that. It's quite a famous story. But they really had some use, because in many cases, just having a tank, a mobile vehicle, an armored vehicle is better than nothing, of course. And what the Polish also did, because the vehicles were already old and obsolete, they installed them also on their armored trains, because they had a very poor road network in Poland, but a very good railroad network. And while making these armored trains to provide armored support, fire support, they're also giving a second life, actually. Then the Renault FT also sees combat later in the war. At first, when France itself is captured, the Vichy regime is installed, and of course they are allowed of the Germans to retain a small force. And since these Renault FT tanks were not really considered as a threat to the Germans, they were also allowed to keep some of those. And in Syria, the Vichy French forces, they used some of these reserve FT tanks on a small scale as well during the battles against British and Allied troops in July and June of 1941. A little bit later, in November 1942, you have the famous Operation Torch. The Americans started arriving at the European theater of war, and in Operation Torch, they land on the North African coast, such as Morocco. And in Morocco, at the port of Safi, a port town, French port town of Safi, French Moroccan port town. And there is an army barracks close to the beach where the American forces are landing, the American 47th Regimental Combat Team to be specific. And in this barracks, they also have a few of these reserve small Vichy-operated Renault FT tanks, and they are used to counter this American force which is landing on the beach. These Americans, they didn't have any armored support, but of course they have their modern weapons with them. And at first they try firing bazookas on the 3 tanks, but for some reason they fail. Maybe they ricocheted, I don't know. They fail to disable the tanks. But then eventually 2 were disabled using rifle grenades by the American troops. And the third one, the third Renault FT tank, he panics, he starts reversing and he crashes into a wall. And then one of those American sergeants landing on the beach, he climbs into the Renault FT tank that was crashed into the wall and uses the cannon to fire upon the French Vichy defenders and provides fire support for the troops landing as well. So quite an interesting action. Then 1 year later at Sicily, you have the Americans again and the British landing at Gela. Yeah, you had the American Rangers landing in force over there. And the Italian troops, which were the first defenders of the beach area, they also had a few Fiat 3000 still in action. So the licensed copy Fiat 3000. And they were used, some were used to guard the San Pietro airfield, which was close to the beach, and some others were dug in. But they were no real match for the Rangers and the weapons that they were holding. They were easily disabled by a bazooka or a small artillery piece that they would bring along. So these are also quite easily dispatched. Maybe I should also talk about the German use of the weapon.
Well, I was going to say, do the Germans use them? Because they often reuse other people's kit.
Yeah, of course. The Germans are very famous for exploiting captured material as Beutepanzer. Following their victories across the whole of Europe, across all of these countries which were still using the old FTs, they capture roughly 1,700 FTs in total, of which 500 were very easily still made serviceable. And although obsolete for frontline combat, the Wehrmacht found very useful secondary roles for these vehicles in the occupied territories. So they would not be sending them to the Eastern Front or anything, but they were used mostly in the countries itself for useful purposes, such as, for example, guarding military installations or airfields, or conducting anti-partisan patrols for training new tank drivers, airfield security, things like that. And also as static defenses. Many of them, or at least the turrets of them, they were integrated into the fortifications of the Atlantic Wall, dug in as pillboxes put on top of a Tobruk kind of structure as a Panzerturm. So many of them were used as well. For example, in Normandy, in January of 1944, there were in total 299 Renault FT turrets recorded, 230 with machine gun, and 69 fitted with 37mm guns. So that's quite a decent amount. And next to the Wehrmacht, the SS also employed around 250 FTs by early 1942, together with other French captured vehicles. And even as the Allied forces had landed in Normandy and are starting their conquest of France, they also still occasionally encountered old Renault FT tanks spread across Europe, sometimes as static fortifications, sometimes really still in active German use. And most notably, a few Renault FT tanks were also deployed by German forces in an improvised defensive role during the Battle for Paris in August 1944. So that's for the German use. A small other uses of the Renault FT as well during World War II. Finland, by 1939, they also still operated a small number of Renault FT tanks, mostly used for recovering captured Soviet material during the Winter War or as semi-entrenched bunkers. But they still had 4 recorded as serviceable in 1942. The Greeks also used a few of them against the Italian invasion in 1940. Yugoslavia, they still had 55, so an entire battalion of 2 companies in 1941. They were used intensively against the Germans as well, and later also seized by Tito's partisan forces to be used against the Germans. In Romania, they also had a large amount of them for internal security duties until late in the war. After the coup of 1944, when they turned against their former German allies, they were also used against them before being confiscated by Soviet troops in 1945. In Spain, in the Spanish Civil War, The communist forces also received 39 Renault FT tanks. And it's quite funny because they were supplied illegally by France, the Soviet Union, and Poland. And not to harm any international relations, they were on paper sold to Uruguay, but actually delivered to the communist forces in Spain, not to offend Germany, of course. But by October of 1939, only 6 remained operational, and also many were captured and reused by nationalist forces. And then you also had Italy, which still has around 90 of these Fiat 3000s in action in 1940, which saw action later at Gela in Sicily. So quite a few users. In total, I count 27 countries in total which have used the Renault FT, used intensively in a large amount, or some of them also just as one vehicle for testing, but 27 countries in total which have used the FT or a licensed copy of the FT tank.
It's a remarkable life for a First World War tank to still be seeing action in 1940, considering and beyond, considering the changes that would happen. Now, you have one in the Belgian Royal Military Museum. Is that a Belgian Renault FT?
Unfortunately not. Perhaps in the past we have considered it as one because we didn't know its history, but unfortunately it's not. I'll just say a small word about the Belgian FTs before I dive into the history of ours. So Belgium, one of the Allied victors of World War I, they're also interested in starting to develop their own tank force after the war. And they were very interested in using the Renault FT for that purpose. So at first they wanted to have a large force of about 250 or even more tanks, but due to budget constraints, they eventually only acquired 49, of which were 26 with the gun tanks, 22 machine gun tanks, and 1 simple radio TSF, so a radio command vehicle. So they got those in 1920, and they would be the core of the newly established Régiment de Chars de Combat, the Regiment of Combat Tanks of Belgium. They were trained at an abandoned German barracks near Plasgaat, later in Ghent, and they were trained by French instructors, which of course had more experience with the vehicle already. They were organized as a single battalion with 3 companies of 8 tanks each, and they were trained in infantry operations, supporting infantry tactics during the 1920s and in the 1930s. Just as their French counterparts, they also purchased 8 Chenard Walker trucks, which were fitted with Belgian Maneuver engines to transport them to ease the logistical constraints. They also developed a really specific uniform to differentiate them from the other branches of the army. They had a kind of alpine berets, which featured an insignia of a medieval helmet on 2 crossed cannons, which is actually the same as the French Régiment d'Artillerie Spéciale had used. So there was a strong link between the two. And some of them also had tanker helmets. They had leather jackets, which would help with the grease and the oil inside the vehicle for protection, and used intensively during the 1920s for training. But then we were getting near the 1930s. Of course, there's a decline in serviceability. The tanks were getting old and obsolete. The Belgian army often considers replacing them, upgrading them. But as always, those plans are always disabled because there's not enough money for that. They're more interested in developing the Air Force, so not a lot of attention paid for the tanks. Instead of replacing them, they only think of 2 small improvements for their vehicles. I believe in the beginning of the 1930s, some of the tanks get a new kind of visor for the machine gun tanks, which would help them with their aiming. And during the training with the infantry, they also found a solution to better communicate with the infantry which would accompany the vehicles. And they install a kind of a doorbell-like functionality, just a simple button that the infantry would be able to click to make the tank aware of their presence. So a bit similar as the Japanese tanks of World War II had, actually. But next to that, no large improvement or replacement is foreseen around 1930. Then in 1931, they only have 14 tanks remaining serviceable, and they're last used in a large military exercise at the barracks town of Leopoldsburg in 1934. But then it's really clear that the tanks are at the end of their life cycle and replacement is needed. And that's also the moment after these exercises when they are retired, and the Belgian tank regiment is officially disbanded in 1935 and is replaced by the core of anti-tank and accompanying weapons, which will be using the T-13 and the T-15 tanks, which I talked about in the previous episode. After the tanks are discarded by this dissolved tank corps, they find a new use with the Belgian police force, the Belgian gendarmerie. They were actually using for a heavy vehicle, which would help them clearing barricades, suppressing riots, maintaining public order, because there had been a lot during the 1930s. Before that, they used trucks for that purpose, but they wanted a vehicle which is a bit more heavy. And they acquire a few of the old Renault FT tanks for that purpose as well, to help them maintain public order. They used them until 1939. And then you get to this Belgian mobilization period of 1939-1940. A lot of international tensions. The Belgian population is mobilizing. And a few of these remaining Renault FT tanks, which are still serviceable, they are pressed back into service as makeshift tractors for hauling Quantais anti-tank barriers, also called the Belgian gates, into positions around the city of Antwerp. But actually, no Renault FT tanks are still in use by the Belgian army when the German invasion of 1940 happens. They have all been discarded by then and are still in depots or left at army grounds, but not being used. When the Germans occupy Belgium, they find a few new purposes for those remaining FT tanks as well. And some of them are used as bomb tractors for the Luftwaffe at the airfield of Deurne by Antwerp. So we have a picture taken after the recapture by the Allies, where you can see one of them being used like that. Just as in all of these other countries, they also find new purposes to bolster their forces. But unfortunately, none of the Belgian FT tanks, as we know, have survived to this present day.
Where does yours come from in the military museum?
So ours in the museum, it's a late production Renault FT tank with a Giraud turret. And this one actually came from the Saumur Tank Museum in France. So the French tank museum over there. It came to our museum in the 90s. And a few years ago, I was actually very curious to learn more about the history of this specific vehicle, because we can only see some manufacturer markings on the vehicle from Renault, from Boulogne-Billancourt, but those don't tell us anything more about the really specific history of this vehicle. And we can see a lot of paint layers present on the vehicle. Also some which are barely still visible, which feature colors of bright green, yellow, black. But this really intrigued us to find more about the specific history of this vehicle as well, before it came to our museum and before it came to Saumur as well, because it's already a 100 years old vehicle and it must have seen some interesting history as well. So how did we start? At first, I started addressing my network, my contacts at Bovington, such as David Willey. I asked, do you know something? Do you have an expert specific for the Renault FT who could maybe help me? And he pointed me to some of his French contacts, and eventually came in contact with Pierre Clavel. He used to be a board member of different councils of the Saumur Tank Museum in the 80s, 90s. So he knew the museum very well. He also knew the vehicle already from his time back then. And he paid us a few visits to help us identify more elements of the vehicle and to actually retrace the specific history of this tank. He eventually made a report about the tank, about everything that he found, of more than 400 pages. And in this report, he analyzed every little bolt, every little detail, every little element that you can find on the tank. And it's very interesting what he learned. So on the tank itself, on its side, you have an L-shaped bracket pointing upwards. This had already been present at Saumur as well, but he had no idea what it was. It wasn't present on any other Renault FT tank, but he had no idea why this strange element was present there, which is clearly not something that the French used during World War I, this L-shaped bracket. Of course, nowadays, compared to 30 years ago, you have the internet. You can compare a lot better with images online. You can come in contact with international experts. And we found out that this L-shaped bracket is very specific to Polish FTs in the 1930s, which used the bracket for holding a specific kind of headlight. So that was a clear indication that this was actually had been a Polish FT tank, so produced in France and delivered to the Polish. And we also found on some of the instruments and inside the tank indications that it was a vehicle that was used by the Polish forces, because they had some very specific firms in Poland that produced also elements to be used inside the vehicle. We investigated the tank some more. We crawled underneath the vehicle, and there we found 2 holes underneath the tank. Very strange. They are both very crudely made. One of them was round and the other one was more squarely shaped. And we eventually found out that these holes were used to connect the tank to a railroad cart, also called a draisine. And that was the final puzzle, that this tank had also been used as a part of an armored train. So Poland in the 1930s, beginning 1930s, they had their obsolete fleet of Renault FT tanks, and they started integrating them as part of their armored trains, because on this kind of railroad cart, the railroad cart would be powered by the tank engine as well. And while the tank on its own could only go about 8 kilometers an hour, on a railroad configuration like this, it could go about 40 kilometers an hour, which is really quite an improvement. So they were used in small independent battalions together with 2 TKS tankettes, and they were used for either protecting the armored train or performing railroad reconnaissance on the tracks. They could dismount of the carriage, and the small TKS tankettes, they would perform reconnaissance in the area, and this older Renault FT tank would stay behind and perform additional firepower if necessary when a cannon would be needed. So very interesting to learn that this is one of the, I believe, somewhere in the 30 tanks that was also had been used for this purpose. And we also know that each of these armored trains had been in action during the German invasion of 1939. So that's also fascinating to hear that it has been in action, although we don't find any more indication or any battle damage or things like that, which could just give us more clues. But that was also interesting to learn. After the German occupation of Poland, the tank has most likely been captured by the Germans in decent condition. We find some elements inside that tell us that the tank was actually repurposed as a Beutepanzer, as a German vehicle. 2 holes in the floor, they were covered by a new flooring of the tank. The tank was also repainted, and it was just a bit refitted to probably be used in a kind of an static emplacement, probably for defending an important checkpoint or an airfield. We think it's used as a static position because also the engine was removed, so it probably didn't have any chance to drive around. But where it was used in Poland and Germany, we have no idea. The story only picks up in 1945 at the small village of Munzingen, which is a small village in the southwest of Germany. There was an army barracks nearby, and that army barracks was used by the American forces, which were in the area, to assemble all kinds of German vehicles that they found in the area. So they're all gathered there for study or just for to keep them in one place, including this Renault FT tank as well. This area, southwest of Germany, it was eventually transferred to the French occupying forces a bit later. They also took over the army barracks and the vehicles present. And these vehicles, they were later also moved to Satory, which is the main staff military center of France, and they were used there to study German equipment, to see what they could learn from them. And this large collection of German vehicles was also part of the core collection, which would eventually become the Saumur Tank Museum. So in the late 60s, early 70s, they were all moved to Saumur, to their first location at the Manège de Bossu, and they were used as this first collection of the new French Tank Museum. The Renault FT tank was one of 2 or 3 which was also present and moved to this first location. And over there, when the new museum opened, it was one of 2 FT tanks which flanked a statue of General Estienne, a bust of General Estienne, and that would be the first thing that visitors would see when they entered the new museum. So the bust of General Estienne, the father of the tank, flanked by these 2 Renault FT tanks. One of the 2, it later moved to the German Army Center at Koblenz, which is also like a reference collection for the German Army. It was moved there. And the other Renault FT tank, it came to our museum first as part of a temporary exhibition about the end of World War I in 1969, I believe. So first as a temporary piece of an exhibition, but later it was agreed to have a permanent exchange with a vehicle from our collection, because we were also very eager to have a Renault FT because of its importance for World War I. It's important as the first tank in use by the Belgian army. So we were also very happy to have it. And that's how it finally became a piece of our collection, and it's still there after all these years to be visited by our museum visitors.
It's remarkable journey from France to Poland to Germany to France to Belgium. Now, people can obviously people are encouraged to go to the Belgian Royal Military Museum to visit. But you have a YouTube channel which you have done an episode looking at the tank. If someone wants to watch your YouTube channel, what is it called?
So together with a colleague, I started a YouTube channel in which we have a few series in which we will go over the history of certain pieces of our collection, aircraft, vehicles, artillery pieces. And the YouTube channel is called Two Dudes Talking Tanks. And our first episode is actually dedicated to the Renault FT Tank, in which we discuss its history and have a look at the example in the Royal Armoured Museum in Brussels and explain the story of how it got there and every other element that you can find on the tank.
Very good. Well, thank you, Robby. Loyal listener, if you'd like to see one of these remarkable little Renault FTs up close, you can find a beautifully preserved example at the Belgian Royal Military Museum in Brussels. And if you'd like to hear more from Robby, check out his YouTube channel, Two Dudes Talking Tanks. Now, if you've enjoyed the show, just a quick reminder, it's only me here behind the microphone. I do all the research, recording and editing myself. So listener support really does help make a difference. Becoming a patron helps keep the podcast going, and you'll get ad-free listening along with bonus excerpts from interviews that didn't make it into the main episodes. You can find out more at patreon.com/WW2 Podcast. I'll put a link in the show notes. Well, that's it for this episode. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our tank and blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice